Thank you for joining us for the second annual Global Kidney Innovation, Expanding Patient Choices and Outcomes, a collaborative partnership event presented by the American Association of Kidney Patients at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I am David Rodriguez, and I am a kidney transplant recipient through a living kidney donor pair exchange donation for almost 9 years. And currently in my profession, I am a patient relations specialist at Transplant Center in San Antonio, Texas. I am honored to be part of AAKP, the oldest and largest independent kidney patient organization in America, as an AAKP ambassador, a member of the AAKP National Board of Directors, and as a member of the AAKP Policy Committee. What AAKP means to me is that their strong commitment in serving patients in kidney disease affected throughout millions of people throughout our country. And I'm honored to be part of it. I am pleased to introduce an ally of experts of Dr. Alan Clergot, a clinical profession of medicine and a Yale University School of Medicine and Vice President, Chief Quality Officer at Yale New Haven Health System, and chair of the American Society of Nephrology and Nephrologist Transforming Dialysis Safety, and Dr. Emily Blumberg, Transplant Infection Disease Specialist, Director of the Transplant Infection Disease Program and Infection Disease Fellowship, University of Pennsylvania, and immediate past president of the American Society of Transplantation. Dr. Clergot and Dr. Blumberg will present on coronavirus kidney community stakeholder response to the global pandemic. On behalf of AAKP and George Washington University, we appreciate Dr. Clergot and Blumberg taking time to share their insights.
Hi, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. The AAKP and GW are really important parts of our whole community, and I'm really honored to be able to speak to you today. What happened earlier this year, as everybody knows, is that COVID-19 suddenly cast itself into our lives. And one of the first cases we knew about were patients in Seattle who were nursing home patients, but also on dialysis, who became deathly ill with COVID-19. And at that time, when we knew that dialysis patients were particularly targets of this really terrible illness, the American Society of Nephrology formed the COVID-19 response team in order to guide the kidney community in dealing with this illness. I was asked to be the co-chair of that group. And so let me share with you some of the work that we've done over these last several months. And then also after that, some really specific questions that patients have asked us that I will share with you. This is the organizational chart that shows how we've divided our work. It shows that there is a response team leadership, and that there are several members of our response team. You'll see them listed to the right of this slide, which includes nephrologists, it includes patients, it includes dialysis nurses, and it includes infectious disease specialists. We've been very lucky that we've been able to work directly with the CDC in deriving those guidelines and best practices that we want to share with our whole kidney community. Our work, as it went along over the months, was then divided into 4 working groups. First was outpatient dialysis, which talked about what the issues are for patients who are going to regular dialysis treatments or at home for dialysis treatments. The second is an inpatient kidney care committee. COVID-19 itself causes damage to the kidneys. And so learning how to best manage patients whose kidneys fail when they are infected with this virus became an important part of our work. So the inpatient kidney care team was the second one. The third is that there were particular issues for home dialysis patients, both home peritoneal and home hemodialysis patients. And so we have a committee looking at those particular issues. And then finally, there are issues for patients who have had kidney transplants. And so we had a separate team of experts talking about that. As we did our work, we also were in communication directly with partners in our community And as you see here is a list of the many partners that we have worked with, either in writing manuscripts or guideline papers, or in conducting webinars, or in doing online teaching, or in other work, particularly around regulation and the government. You'll see here is a very diverse group of partners that we've had, which includes our dialysis providers, the federal government in many of its organizations, professional groups, patient groups, and other countries and their connections. Our response team has been really directed at several different specific tasks. One is education. The second is collaboration. The third is advocacy on behalf of our kidney community with patients and providers. And finally, ensuring that the patient's voice is included. And in the rest of this talk, I'll be talking about each one of these very specific goals. So our first task clearly was to share education. What did we know about this infection? What can we find out about how it affects kidney patients, patients on dialysis, patients who've had kidney transplants? And our primary source was to talk directly with the CDC. The CDC is that group of experts in our federal government who work hard to gather together best practices, to give the best advice of the way to take care of and mitigate the disease should this infection manifest itself. And so very early on, we worked with the CDC and established the COVID-19 web page. The web address is shown here, and this is a dynamic document that's online that we change and update continuously to help educate what CDC best practices are and what we've learned from our partners. We have posters that we have distributed in English and in Spanish to be used in dialysis facilities. We've developed a compendium of medical health resources for both staff and patients, because what we have found is that this is not a disease or a pandemic that affects only the body and only affects the lungs or the kidneys, as we know it does. We know that patients who suffer with this disease and the staff so stressed at taking care of patients with this disease have very substantial emotional and mental needs. And so we have developed a series of resources for both patients and for staff for these mental health needs. We've been conducting weekly educational webinars, and I'll show you shortly a list of the topic of those webinars. But when we first started this months ago, we thought we'd have one big webinar that helped to describe where we were. And we very quickly learned that there were so many needs, and so our patients and professionals in our community had so many needs to understand the disease, understand ways of dealing with it, understand what we know and what we don't know, that we ended up doing weekly webinars to help share that knowledge. We've also had an opportunity to do publications in both popular and in professional juried publications about this disease. And finally, we've had a whole series of media interviews that I'll also spend a few minutes describing to you. Here's a list of the topics for the COVID-19 webinar series that we've been conducting. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to say, if you just take a look at these titles, you will see that we talk about CDC recommendations, we talk about hospital care in addition to in-center dialysis care. You see, we share what we know about the acute kidney injury that this disease has caused. You see, we talk in these webinars about challenges to the kidney transplant patients and to kidney transplant facilities and how they have dealt with this pandemic. You see that we've talked about transitions of care. How do we manage patients when they leave the hospital and are then returning to the dialysis facility? And I'll be spending a few more words later on talking about that. We've been talking about some of the physiology. What's the connection between the lungs and the kidneys that may be responsible for the damage we see with acute kidney injury? And then finally, we have had a real focus on telehealth, Boy, we had very little of remote telehealth before this pandemic, but you and we sure have lots of experience now. And so a really good question is, what does that teach us, not only about the pandemic time, but about the times in the future? What role does telemedicine have in the ongoing care of dialysis and transplant patients? Here's a list of both the publications on the left side of this slide and of the popular press and media on the right side of this slide that we've had an opportunity to be involved with. Again, I'm not going to read all of these for you, but what I want to show is that, first of all, on the publication side, we have been able to publish in some of the best read kidney journals like CJASN and Kidney International, and several other publications, what we've learned and what guidance we give to professionals and to patients about best care. And on the right side of this slide, you'll see that I and others have been interviewed by the Washington Post, by the New York Times, by the Irish Times, and by a series of other newspapers and other publications about our experience with this disease. And we've also had an opportunity to be interviewed on television. PBS NewsHour ran a segment in which I had a chance to talk about this illness. And in several other opportunities, several of us have been on TV. So we've gotten a really wide exposure in sharing what we know and what we don't know about the effect of this virus on kidneys and on our kidney patients. Our webinars alone now have reached more than 40,000 people who've either seen them directly or have downloaded them. And if we include the interviews that we've done and the publications that we've been part of, it's clear that we've reached in the numbers of millions of people. Our collaboration with the CDC remains a central piece of our work. And as you see here, there are 2 places that have been on the web that are continuously updated, that continue to be great sources of information. One is information that we have here listed as screening and management of COVID-19 in outpatient dialysis facilities, and then recommendations on the care of hospitalized patients with COVID-19. And here you'll see some of the examples of collaboration we've had with the community. Perhaps the most interesting one of all has been that we have hosted weekly calls with the chief medical officers from all of the dialysis providers in the US. These are weekly calls that are often attended by 20 to 30 different chief medical officers that provides a platform for them to share information, share experience, share best practices, understand what the challenges are. A real chance for making sure that whoever the dialysis provider is, that we're doing the best and we're doing the most efficacious, the best known therapies for all of our patients. We've gotten involved with Journal Club Twitter chats. I became a tweeter, never thought I would before, never joined. People have called me a twit, but this is the first time I've ever actually done any tweeting. Got out to lots of people, apparently did well. We conducted an international webinar with the Indian Society of Nephrology on COVID-19. As you all know, the US was hit and hit hard, but then India was subsequently hit hard too. So we think some of our experience and knowledge did very well getting to India. And finally, we've had a couple of different webinars in which we provided information to dialysis patient citizens in webinars. And now, of course, is this opportunity we have with AAKP and GW to do this one. It's also important that we've had collaboration in understanding what happens when things really get hot. You all know, of course, that New York City became an epicenter of this illness that really provided huge challenges to the healthcare system. On Easter weekend, we got a call, the ASN got a call, from 2 of the hospitals in New York asking for our assistance to make sure that they got all of the supplies and equipment that they needed to do their work. Because these hospitals found that the need for dialysis machines, cartridges, and then dialysis fluid for the continuous dialysis machines was running very low, and they were very worried about that. So I'll show you some of the work that we did looking at this hotspot, how we learned about it, and I'm hoping that that knowledge then can be used in other hotspots that develop over the next coming weeks and months. This then describes exactly what we did, where we were able to communicate directly with suppliers, with hospitals in New York, and then also with the government to understand what the need was, how it was manifest, to make sure that all patients got exactly what they needed in this great time of need. Here, for example, is a graph that shows 7 different hospital organizations in the greater New York area, labeled A through G. And for each of them, it shows the number of ICU beds before the pandemic, the number of beds in the midst of the pandemic in mid-April, and then how many of those beds were occupied by COVID-19 patients. And finally, how many of those people with COVID-19 in ICUs needed dialysis or continuous renal replacement therapy. You'll see if you look at this slide that overall, the number of ICU beds in New York City was virtually doubled. Can you just imagine that? So in addition to all their regular ICUs, their intensive care units, they created intensive care units in operating rooms, in radiology suites, in procedure areas, in other areas of the hospital that had otherwise been doing other things. And they doubled the number of ICU beds. When we looked at the percent of those many new ICU beds that had COVID-19 positive patients in them, in New York, it ranged from 57 to 100%. So not only had they doubled the number of ICU beds, but the vast majority of those beds were occupied by very sick patients with COVID-19. And then finally, of those very sick people in ICUs, what percent of them needed dialysis because of kidney failure? And the answer was between 27% and 65%. So acute kidney failure was a very important part and a devastating part of this illness. On this slide, and you needn't look at the small print, but on this slide, we also estimated what the fluid needs were to accommodate all of these very sick people. How much dialysate fluid was necessary to do the job, and would there be enough fluid in the week or 2 after this survey was done? And suffice it to say that as we looked at this, it turned out, number one, that each of the hospitals managed to take care of all of the patients who needed acute dialysis. They did that by being creative in the kind of dialysis they gave, using both continuous therapies and other therapies like SLED, that is a discontinuous or more standard type of dialysis, of using acute peritoneal dialysis, and by increasing the shipments of fluid that came from the manufacturers. So this analysis, which we did, has in turn been very helpful to the suppliers, to the hospitals, and to the federal government in understanding what needs to be done in new hotspots around the country. Our role in advocacy has been extremely important to us, and as you see, we have outreach to the Navajo Nation. We've issued joint statements with several different organizations as listed, and a joint letter on behalf of the ASN and the NKF about making sure that our vulnerable populations, like dialysis patients, have access to all of the intensive therapies that they need. We wrote a joint statement with the American College of Emergency Room Physicians. We worked hard with CMS and the government to have waivers to usual types of requirements so that medical staff could concentrate on taking care of the large number of new patients that they had to do. So what I want to just first is quickly summarize what we learned. First of all, chronic kidney disease patients are at higher risk of acquiring COVID-19 and at higher risk of complications if they become infected. Second, kidney failure is a common complication of this infection. Third, hospitals need to prepare for more ICU beds, more ventilators, and more dialysis, all the different types of dialysis and their equipment. Dialysis staff shortages in hotspots must be anticipated. And finally, home dialysis may be a safer location than in-center in a pandemic to reduce spread. And so I want to then go through some questions that some patients have asked me before. First, how do I protect myself? And the answer for a dialysis patient is exactly the same as everyone else. And the answer is be careful to keep social distancing, wear a mask if you're ever near other people, and particularly if you're indoors. And obviously, come to dialysis and wear a mask through the whole of dialysis. What happens if you get COVID-19? Well, first, most people and most dialysis patients who get COVID-19 fare very well, survive the illness. Most do not need to come to the hospital. But if you do need to come to the hospital, then once you're discharged from the hospital, what can you expect? We have found that many dialysis patients who come out of the hospital continue to have some coughing, continue to have some shortness of breath, can feel muscle weakness, can sometimes have flashbacks, sort of what PTSD patients do, and sometimes have kind of mental fogginess. What we know is that those types of symptoms usually get better, but to be patient with yourself and patient with your body as it recovers, even after you leave the hospital. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. Let me again thank AAKP and George Washington for hosting this really important session. And if there's one thing I do want to leave everyone with is that we really are in this together. Patient-centered care remains the focus of what we're doing. The patient's voice is critical to what we're doing. Any information that you have that you can share with the American Society of Nephrology would be great. And likewise, ask us to share with you in order for us to conquer this disease. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Emily Blumberg, the past president of the American Society of Transplantation and the director of Transplant Infectious Diseases at the Penn Medicine Transplant Institute. I'd like to thank the AAKP for inviting me to speak today about COVID-19, staying safe during a global pandemic. As of July 14th, there were over 3 million cases of COVID-19 in the United States, and the number is steadily rising. But as you can see, the increase in COVID cases is not the same throughout the United States. In fact, there are some areas where the rise is dramatic and other areas where the disease seems to be a little bit more under control. What does this mean for me? I think in thinking about COVID-19, there are two general reactions most of us have: being terrified or being in denial. What I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is share with you some tips so that I think we can all find some middle ground. It's difficult to know what to believe about COVID-19. There's so much information coming at us in real time that it's hard to process it at all. There are so many different sources that we get our information from, whether it's the media, our friends, our healthcare providers. It's very confusing because what's in one day is out the next, and it makes you feel like it's hard to trust anyone. So what I'm going to share with you today is some valuable information and then some trusted sources that you can go to whenever you need advice, and realize that these sources are being currently updated, so it's important to check them frequently. Let's start with a few tips about how to stay safe and protect yourself. Remember that COVID-19 is spread by person-to-person contact, so the best thing that you can do is avoid exposure to infected people. Now, you're not always going to know who's an infected person. So one thing that you should really be practicing is social distancing. In other words, putting space between yourself and others. And so we typically use 6 feet of space between people who are not your regular household contact at all times. You want to avoid frequent trips to crowded places like stores and even the pharmacy. And you especially want to avoid crowds and mass gatherings, even if your state says it's okay. Remember, Florida was okay not so very long ago, and now they're looking at the worst version of the pandemic that we've seen in the United States to date. We often get asked, do we really need to wear a mask? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's tremendous evidence that masks help, and there's more and more coming every day. We know that this virus is spread by droplets, the things that come when you cough or sneeze. But it turns out that there's probably fine particles known as aerosols that can also spread the virus. And it's clear that wearing a mask reduces the spread of this virus. And if you had any questions about that, a report presented in this week in the MMWR showed the 2 hairdressers who actually had COVID did not spread it to their customers because they were all wearing masks, not just the hairdressers, but the customers as well. Now, there are a lot of different types of masks. There are masks that are used in medical settings, the so-called surgical masks or the N95s. These are not required unless you're in a healthcare setting performing healthcare activities. In fact, standard face coverings like that worn by Dr. Fauci are actually very effective. And these are just cloth face coverings. And there's actually information on the CDC website about how to create your own if you haven't been able to purchase it. You want the cloth face covering to be opaque. In other words, you shouldn't be able to see through it, but you should be able to breathe comfortably through it. Now, you'll see some people wearing these so-called vented masks, and you want to avoid those because that's actually a better way to trap the virus. So make sure that your mask has no specific venting or holes in it, but can fully cover your face. There are a lot of ways to wear a mask, but there's only one right way. In all circumstances, be sure that the mask covers your nose, your mouth, and goes under your chin. It should be fit snugly around your ears so that it doesn't move around. When you see people wearing masks that aren't covering their mouth and their nose, please advise them to do so because it only works if you wear it properly. Please note that it's important to wash your hands frequently. And in this schema from the World Health Organization, you can see that means using soap and water and washing all surfaces of your hands, including the palms and the thumbs, all fingers, including your thumb. You want to turn the water off with your elbow, not with your freshly washed hand, and use a fresh towel or paper towel to dry yourself off afterwards. Also remember to use proper etiquette when you're coughing and sneezing. Do not cough into your hands, but cough into your elbow or your sleeve or into a tissue, which you then dispose of. After coughing or sneezing, be sure to wash your hands. We often get asked if you can go to work. And what I tell my patients is that depends on what you do for work. At this time, if you are still able to work from home, that will limit your potential exposures and is advisable. But not everybody can work from home. And so before returning to work, or if you're already at work, we want you to think about what your work environment is. Are there a lot of people around you? Are they potentially contagious? Is there a way to work from home instead if they are, or at least to isolate yourself from people who may be contagious and a source of infection for you? If you're concerned that your work environment is not safe, please talk to your provider. They may be able to provide you with an acceptable document that may allow you to continue to work from home. But we know that most of us don't live in a vacuum, and we have family members or roommates who may be going to work as well, and certainly we can't guarantee that they can have excuses to go stay home as well. So I think it's important to think about where they work and what they do and what safeguards are in place. Just because they work in an environment that may put them in contact with COVID, it may not be dangerous if in fact they are able to use proper precautions. For example, in our workplace, where many of the essential workers have direct contact with patients with COVID, there have been such good safeguards in place that in fact the majority of healthcare workers who've actually acquired it have acquired it from unsafe activities outside the hospital, because we know that we are able to protect them in their place of work. So remember, going to work is only part of the discussion. Some of you have children in your household, and there's a lot of concern about return to school, especially at this time of year. We all want our children to be well educated, and it's very clear that being in a school environment is something that can help with this. But it's important to understand what the educational options are and what the safeguards are in place at the school your child will be attending. It's also important to know what's going on in your area so that you know what concerns there might be with the other children going to school and the teachers and support staff in those schools. And so I think you should be asking some hard questions of the school systems about what they're doing to keep everybody safe. And if you have any concerns, you should discuss this with your healthcare provider and your child's pediatrician. Many people are concerned about seeking medical care at this time. You may have appointments, you may be going to dialysis, a doctor's office. Sometimes we can offer telehealth, and that may be an option. But you may still need tests, either labs or radiology testing. And there's a lot of concern about getting that done. There's also concern about getting transplants. But remember that transplantation is being done with a lot of precautions in place, testing both you and your donor to make sure that there will be no COVID transmission or the reactivation of COVID in the transplant period. We know that we can keep things safe around you if you are our partner in doing so. And so sometimes the answer for getting a transplant is yes, ultimately, this may be the safest option for you. So what should you be asking? You should be saying, are there safeguards? What are they? And please let me know how I can be part of keeping myself safe. We definitely do not want you to neglect your medical care. Finding out after the fact that something has happened that could be preventable is not a good idea. And most importantly, stay in touch with your providers. All of us providing care to patients at this time have put a lot of thought and effort into keeping people safe. And so we put a lot of safeguards in place, and we want you to know that as we provide care for you and ask you to come to offices or obtain tests, that we're doing it with that in mind. How would I know if I have COVID-19? The symptoms vary from person to person, and in fact, some people may not have any symptoms. The most common symptoms are colds and flu-like symptoms, but stomach upset and diarrhea have also been seen commonly. And a minority of patients are going to get severe pneumonia and breathing problems that require hospitalization. And if you are at all concerned that you could have COVID, you should definitely call your provider. Discuss with them the symptoms. If you have difficulty breathing, lasting pain or pressure in your chest, new confusion or failure to stay awake, or bluish changes around your lips or in your face, please call 911 immediately so that you can be properly attended to. If you need to be hospitalized, make sure you contact your transplant center so they can appropriately give instructions to whoever will be taking care of you. At this time, there are no specific medications directed at COVID-19 that are licensed for care in the United States or elsewhere, and most of our treatments are still aimed at symptoms. In medical centers, however, there may be other medications that are directed at the virus or at the side effects of the virus that are being given as part of off-label use or as part of trials or for compassionate use. These are not medications you can get over the counter, and they will be prescribed to you in a healthcare setting exclusively. If you think you are sick, please call your provider to determine the most appropriate management of your infection. What's especially important is that you not stop your regular medications without discussing this with your provider first. And this is true especially of your immunosuppression. Once you begin to recover from COVID-19, please do not leave your home if you're feeling better until your provider says it's safe to do so. It's important to recognize that people on immune suppression, and that includes transplant patients, may remain contagious longer than other patients. So we want to make sure that you're not transmitting the virus to others. If you've been exposed to COVID-19 and you are not sick, the typical incubation period is somewhere in the neighborhood of a few days to 2 weeks. Please let your transplant doctor know that you were exposed and separate yourself from the infected patient. Wash your hands frequently with soap and water or use a hand sanitizer. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with your unwashed hands. Avoid sharing household items with that contact. And make sure you clean all high-touch surfaces like counters, tabletops, doorknobs, bathroom fixtures, toilets, phones, keyboards, tablets, and bedside tables every day. And of course, wash your laundry thoroughly. These are very scary times, but I want to leave you with the thought that it's not all bad news. I've been in infectious diseases for a long time, and I've never seen such rapid pace of discovery. So far, there's over 31,000 publications and pre-publications talking about COVID in the medical literature. The degree of global engagement and collaboration and the enormous number of scientific minds directed at this is actually unheard of up to now. The work of so many organizations, including the AAKP and the American Society of Transplant, to provide educational initiatives to help people cope with this has been astronomical. We've seen unprecedented collaboration of government, industry, and the medical community, and so much innovation occurring in medical practice, including telehealth and more efficient care. And overall, I think we've created a much safer healthcare environment. And I really do believe there's a vaccine on the horizon, although I think we have to be realistic that it's not going to be there available for all of us in the next couple of months, but certainly within the next year. Interestingly enough, these vaccines are not being created with live virus, and so they should be safe for administration in immunosuppressed hosts, including transplant patients. I'd like to leave you with some sources you can rely on to get reliable information. These include the American Society of Transplantation and Power to Save, the CDC, UNOS, and of course, AAKP. We want you to know you can also reach out to your local public health departments and of course, your transplant center. Please be aware that this is a rapidly changing field, and so you want to make sure that your information is fact-based and that it's current and that it's pertinent to your own health situation, whether that be transplantation or having end-stage renal disease. Please stay safe and never hesitate to ask if you have questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kilgore and Dr. Bloomberg, for their presentation today.